On February 17, 2020, something strange happened in a neuroscience lab in Germany. A group of researchers at the Max Planck Institute were studying people who don't have an inner voice. No running commentary in their heads, no silent narrator, no thinking in words. Just quiet. And yet, these people solve problems, understand emotions, make decisions, and live their lives like the rest of us. And that day, during a brain scan, one participant said something shocking. "I don't hear thoughts, I just see the solutions." No voice, no language, just pure understanding. When scientists compared his brain activity to a typical subject, someone with a loud, constant inner monologue, the difference was enormous. It was as if the two people were using two different operating systems of the mind. And that, my friend, is where our story begins. Because this research echoes a question raised almost 50 years earlier by a man named Julian Jaynes. A question so audacious that even today scientists whisper about it. What if consciousness, the thing you're using right now to listen to me, is not as old as we think it is? What if, for most of human history, we were not conscious the way we are today? What if the ancient mind worked differently, not through self-reflection, but through hallucinated voices that people believed were gods? You heard that right. According to Jaynes, humans once lived with a split mind, one half giving commands, the other half hearing those commands as an external voice. A mind with two chambers, a bicameral mind. And when that system collapsed, human consciousness was born. But before we go back in time, let's stay here, in the present moment, because you and I are surrounded by clues that support Jaynes's idea. Take November 2014, New York City. A huge research project studying auditory hallucinations finds that even today, millions of people around the world hear voices that feel external, commanding, divine, protective, or terrifying. Not because they're broken, but because their brains are wired differently. Or look at the famous 1960s split brain experiments, where scientists cut the corpus callosum to stop severe epilepsy. Suddenly, the two halves of the brain acted like two separate individuals, sometimes disagreeing, sometimes fighting for control. One patient tried to button his shirt with one hand, while the other hand unbuttoned it. Two minds, one body. And then there's trauma research from 2022 showing that under extreme stress, the brain can create internal voices or separate thought streams to cope. So ask yourself, if the human brain can do this today, under pressure, in crisis, in silence, what was it capable of thousands of years ago when the world was ruled by fear, chaos, ritual, and the unknown? What if ancient people didn't pray to gods? They heard them. What if laws, myths, commandments, and prophecies were not metaphors, but literal hallucinations, the voice of the right hemisphere interpreted as divine instruction? And what if, one day, those voices stopped? Imagine it. A world collapsing, cities burned, empires crumbled, leaders vanished. And suddenly, in the silence, humanity is forced to do something it has never done before. Think for itself. Reflect, question, choose. Not obey an inner voice, but analyze it. That, my friend, might be the day consciousness was born. Not millions of years ago, but just a few thousand. A new mental software, a new narrator, a new you. So tonight, as we step into this journey together, I want you to hold on to one idea. Consciousness is not a thing, it's a story, a process, a voice we learn to create, a voice we still don't understand. And over the next chapters, we're going to explore this story through real science, ancient history, philosophy, human experiences, and the future of the mind itself. But for now, take a breath. The night is calm, your mind is open, and the world is quiet. Sit back, my friend. You're listening to Wise Alchemy. Let's begin. Let me take you back. Not thousands of years, not to ancient temples or dusty tablets, but to a moment much closer. March 3rd, 2006. A 23-year-old man in London walked into a clinic complaining about something unusual. I hear a voice telling me exactly what to do, but I don't feel crazy. I feel guided. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't distressed. He wasn't losing control. The voice was calm, measured, directive, almost fatherly. The doctors scanned his brain, and what they found shocked them. The activity wasn't coming from the auditory center, but from an area involved in decision-making. Meaning, the instructions he heard didn't come from an external hallucination, but from his own brain separated from his conscious awareness. A thought that felt like another being. A command that sounded like someone else. And when the doctors told him this, he looked down at his hands and whispered, "So the voice is me." This, my friend, is where our journey truly begins. Because Julian Jaynes believed something revolutionary. Ancient humans lived like this all the time. Not hearing thoughts, but hearing voices. Voices that felt separate, authoritative, divine. And to understand this theory, we need to explore one simple idea. Consciousness isn't the default setting of the human brain. It's an upgrade, a late invention, a recent software patch in the long operating system of human history. Imagine waking up one morning in 1500 BCE. You don't think. You don't narrate your decisions. You don't debate choices in your head. You simply act. The left hemisphere perceives the world, and when a difficult decision appears, danger, hunger, conflict, ritual, the right hemisphere sends a message, a voice, clear, external, absolute, and you obey. This wasn't metaphor. To ancient humans, the voice wasn't an inner dialogue. It was a literal instruction from the gods, ancestors, spirits, something beyond them. History supports this. The Iliad contains no word for mind, self, or consciousness. No inner monologue, no internal conflict. Heroes simply hear gods telling them what to do. Ancient prophets spoke of divine commands that sounded auditory, not internal. And ancient kings often described hearing the voice of the god in the chamber of the temple as clearly as you hear a friend. And the most interesting part, archaeology reveals no private diaries, no reflective writings, no personal introspection from early civilizations, because self-reflection didn't exist. Not yet. Now imagine this. Your city collapses. Your king dies. Your temple burns. Your rituals fail. Your gods fall silent. This isn't fiction. This is the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, a real historical disaster. Civilizations collapsed across the Mediterranean. Trade routes vanished, languages changed, famine spread, war became relentless. And according to Jaynes, something else collapsed: the bicameral mind. The voices that once guided humans fell silent, not because the gods were gone, but because large-scale chaos broke the old mental system. Think of it like an emergency generator failing. The brain could no longer outsource decisions to a hallucinated voice. The world was too unpredictable. So humans needed something new: self-reflection, introspection, internal decision-making, conscious thought. For the first time, humans had to think about their own thinking. And this, Jaynes argued, is how consciousness was born. Not through evolution's slow crawl, but through crisis, a shock to the mental system. Pause for a moment. Imagine being the first human in your village to experience an internal thought. Not a voice from the gods, not a command, but a quiet inner whisper. What should I do? It would have felt like a spiritual event, a transformation, a private universe unfolding inside your skull. This is why the earliest philosophical texts, from ancient Greece to classical China to early India, appear suddenly within a few centuries of each other. Why? Because introspection was new, and humans were struggling to understand this strange new voice inside. We see it in early writings. Know thyself. Examine your life. The mind is a chariot. Awareness is a lamp. The self observes itself. The world had become confusing. The gods were silent, and so humans turned inward. A revolution began, in thought, in identity, in responsibility. If the bicameral mind truly existed, if ancient humans once heard God voices generated by their own brains, then a question naturally follows. Do any traces of this system still exist today? In us, in modern people, in modern minds? The answer, my friend, is yes, and the evidence is all around us. Let me take you to July 14th, 2003, Iraq. A soldier named Michael is pinned behind a broken wall, trapped under fire, adrenaline surging through his body like electricity. In that moment of terror, when thought collapses and pure instinct takes over, Michael hears a voice. Calm, authoritative, external. It says, "Move now." He listens. He dives. He survives. Later, when the battle ends and the dust settles, he tells the military psychologist, "I heard the order. I heard it clearly, but no one was there." And the psychologist replies gently, "That voice was you." Modern neuroscience confirms this. Under extreme stress, life or death intensity, the brain can revert to a bicameral-like state. Decision-making splits. One part perceives, one part commands, and the conscious mind watches, confused. This is exactly what Jaynes suggested about ancient people. Not madness, but a survival mechanism. December 2012, California. A mother is driving on an icy road when her car slips, spins, and crashes into a ditch. She's conscious but panicked. Her child is crying. Smoke is rising. The engine is creaking. And then she hears it. A voice, soft, reassuring, as if someone is sitting in the passenger seat. Undo your seatbelt first. She obeys automatically. Later, she tries to explain it. It felt like my mother was guiding me, but she's been dead for 8 years. But the paramedics and the psychologist say the same thing. In extreme situations, the brain creates a guiding voice to cut through panic. Sound familiar? It should. This is bicameral logic activating within the modern mind, the ancient operating system still hiding beneath the conscious narrative. Let's shift from danger to mastery. Peak athletes, musicians, surgeons, pilots often describe something eerie, a moment where they stop thinking and a deeper intelligence takes control. A tennis player once said, "During the final set, a voice told me where to hit. It wasn't me, it was something." A pianist described it as, "My hands were being guided." A neurosurgeon explained as, "In high-pressure moments, I stopped being me. Another mind operates the body." Modern psychology calls this flow state, dissociation of agency, transient hypofrontality. Jaynes would call it something else, a temporary reactivation of bicameral cognition. Not unhealthy, not abnormal, just ancient. Across cultures, people report hearing ancestors, spirits, angels, intuition, the universe, a guiding presence, my higher self. But when neuroscientists study these moments, they often find that the right hemisphere activates voice-like patterns, while the left hemisphere interprets them as external messages. It's not proof of Jaynes' theory, but it aligns uncannily with it. The brain generating internal guidance that feels like another being. Not imagination, not delusion, but a different mode of consciousness, one we rarely acknowledge. Here's something fascinating. Children show bicameral traits far more than adults. Imaginary friends that talk to them, voices guiding them in games, commands that feel external, decisions made without self-reflection. Piaget, the developmental psychologist, called this animistic cognition, but Jaynes suggested this might be the original human mindset. Children outgrow it when the modern conscious mind takes over. Humanity, he argued, went through the same process. It means that the bicameral mind didn't vanish completely. It echoes in trauma, in mastery, in childhood, in prayer, in intuition, in panic, in peak performance, in moments when the conscious narrator shuts off and a deeper voice steps in. And if this ancient voice can still appear today, then perhaps Jaynes was not describing a fantasy, or a metaphor, or a poetic idea. Perhaps he was describing a real evolutionary stage of human psychology that lives quietly inside all of us, waiting, guiding, whispering. Let me begin with a story. October 21, 2011. A 29-year-old woman from Chicago is sitting in a therapist's office, hands shaking, voice trembling. She says, "I feel like there's a part of me that watches and another part that lives. Sometimes the watcher talks. Sometimes it tells me what to do." The therapist isn't surprised. He works with trauma. He knows the brain fractures under extreme pain. He knows what we're about to explore. The brain can split into separate cells when consciousness is overwhelmed. Not because the person is broken, but because the brain is trying to survive. And this split, this division between the watcher and the actor, is eerily similar to Jaynes's bicameral mind. Modern neuroscience shows us something stunning. When someone experiences overwhelming trauma, abuse, war, disaster, long-term fear, the conscious narrative can shut down, and another internal system takes its place. This often looks like a commanding inner voice, automatic actions, detached perspective, feeling controlled internally, a sense that decisions happen without conscious thought. Sound familiar? This is exactly what Jaynes described in Ancient Humans. Not hearing thoughts, but hearing commands. Not reflecting deeply, but obeying a voice that feels external. Trauma researchers today call this dissociation, structural dissociation, protective internal parts, survival identities. Jaynes called it a bicameral echo. When a person is overwhelmed, the brain does something intelligent. It creates a second system to handle the pain. A hidden operator, a protector voice, a command voice, a guiding voice, a watcher presence. One trauma survivor described it as, "There's a version of me that talks to me when the real me can't handle life." This, my friend, is how the ancient mind might have worked every day. Not just in trauma, not just in emergencies, but as the default mental structure. You and I love to believe that we are conscious beings in full control, but neuroscience says otherwise. Consciousness is fragile. Primitive systems are robust. When life becomes too intense, the narrator collapses, and the bicameral-like system takes over. Reflex, instinct, command, hallucinated authority, automatic decision-making. This explains why people hear voices under stress, why soldiers feel guided, why survivors report internal commands, why extreme grief produces the voice of a loved one, why meditative states silence the narrator entirely. Consciousness is not the driver, it is the storyteller. The driver might be something older, something deeper. Dissociation is often misunderstood. People imagine blankness or zoning out or emotional numbness. But dissociation can also mean feeling two minds inside. One giving instructions, one watching, one acting, one narrating, one protecting. These parts are not demons, not spirits, not supernatural forces. They are ancient psychological systems that evolved to keep humans alive long before introspective consciousness existed. Jaynes believed the bicameral mind was basically a permanent, everyday, functional form of dissociation. A survival mind, a divided mind, a mind that outsourced decisions to hallucinated authority. Under trauma today, we temporarily return to that system. It's not madness, it's history, written inside our neurons. Today around the world, refugees, soldiers, abuse survivors, people in hostage situations, people in extreme poverty, people in spiritual rituals, monks in isolation, meditators in silence, grieving parents, lonely elderly individuals often report hearing guiding voices that feel external. Not always harmful, sometimes comforting,
sometimes wise, sometimes commanding. Ancient humans lived in constant stress, constant danger, constant ritual, constant uncertainty. So of course their brains used the same emergency system that trauma survivors use today. The bicameral system wasn't an oddity. It was adaptation. Jaynes didn't claim ancient people were crazy. He claimed they were different. Their consciousness was structured differently. Less self-reflection, more externalized decision-making, more reliance on internal voices, less abstract identity, more obedience to gods. When civilization grew stable, the bicameral system faded. But under stress, your mind can still revert to it. This is why people pray and feel answers. People talk to lost loved ones. Intuition feels like a whisper. The gut feeling is a voice-like impulse. The subconscious speaks like a separate entity. Athletes feel guided. Writers feel dictated to. Children talk to imaginary guides. None of this is random. It's an ancient code, a backup system, a psychological relic. And sometimes we still use it. We uncovered something crucial. The bicameral mind didn't disappear. It hides beneath consciousness. It emerges when the narrator collapses. You saw how trauma, panic, extreme focus, grief, meditation, childhood, spiritual practice, high-pressure moments can all reactivate ancient cognitive modes. This chapter is the bridge between modern psychology and ancient cognition.
Have you ever wondered what it felt like to be a human 3,000 years ago? Not how they dressed, not what they ate, not how they farmed or fought. I mean, what was happening inside their mind? What was the inner experience? Was it anything like ours? Because if Julian Jaynes was right, the answer is surprising. Ancient humans didn't think the way you think. They didn't hear their own voice. They didn't narrate their life. They didn't reflect inward. They lived in a mental world closer to instinct, ritual, and command, and further from self-awareness than you might believe. Let's step into that world together. Imagine waking up in 1500 BCE. You open your eyes. There is no inner monologue. No voice saying, "I should get up." No planning. No reflection. No, "Who am I?" No imagining the future. You simply act. Your day is guided by ritual, habit, culture, tradition, survival, and above all, a voice. A voice you believe is divine. Not your voice, not your thoughts. A voice with authority that feels outside you. When danger comes, you don't weigh options. You hear, "Run," and you run. When you must make a sacrifice, you don't agonize morally. You hear, "Offer the goat," and you obey. There is no internal debate, no wrestling with conscience, no internal back and forth. And to you, my friend, this is normal. Let me give you something shocking. In the Iliad, one of the oldest Western stories, characters do not think. They do not hesitate. They do not introspect. They do not wrestle with choices internally. Every major action is caused by Athena commanding, Apollo whispering, Hera directing, Zeus influencing. The gods are everywhere because, according to Jaynes, they were hallucinated instructions from the right hemisphere of the brain. Humans didn't say, "I feel anger." They said, "A god has placed rage inside me." No introspection, no emotional ownership, no internal narrative, just command, action. Egyptian inscriptions are even more explicit. Dozens of pharaohs wrote, "The god spoke to me in my chamber. My Ka gives me instruction. I hear the voice of Ra inside the temple." To them, this was normal. The temple wasn't a spiritual metaphor. It was a trigger for hallucinated guidance. And the Ka? Scholars believe it represents a second internal agent, exactly what Jaynes described. In ancient Mesopotamia, gods didn't just inspire, they ordered. Tablets describe, "The god told me to build. The goddess commanded the king. My personal deity directed my hand." Notice something? No one says, "I thought, I decided, I planned, I reflected." Those are modern brain functions. Ancient humans attributed all internal guidance to external gods because they had no concept of self-generated thought. Ancient societies were extremely rigid. Complex rituals, strict hierarchies, seasonal routines, predictable roles. This structure supported the bicameral mind. People didn't question commands. They obeyed the internal voice because everything in their culture reinforced obedience. Their mental world was stable because their external world was stable. Until it wasn't. We'll explore that collapse later. Let's walk through an ordinary day. A woman wakes before dawn. She performs ritual tasks. She moves efficiently, but without self-reflection. She prepares wheat, tends to children, and follows tradition. When decisions arise, a voice she considers sacred guides her. Not metaphor, not poetry, real auditory hallucination. This is not primitive. It's structured. It's predictable. It works as long as society remains stable. Let me tell you something powerful. Ancient people didn't look inward because there was no inward to look at. Emotions were gods. Impulses were spirits. Decisions were divine commands. Dreams were messages. Visions were revelations. Self was not yet discovered. The human mind was a theater with two characters, the acting self, the doer, and the commanding voice, the God. And consciousness, the quiet narrator you and I rely on every moment, did not yet exist as a unified system. You now understand, pre-conscious humans didn't have inner monologues. They interpreted internal processes as external gods. Archaeology and literature support this. Daily decisions came through hallucinated guidance. Introspection was non-existent. Rituals and structure held the bicameral system together. This was not metaphor. This was their mental reality. And my friend, once you see this world through their eyes, the rest of Jaynes' theory suddenly becomes imaginable, because the next chapter explains how everything fell apart. My friend, before we go any further, I want to strip Jaynes' theory down to its core, because people misunderstand it.
They think he said ancient people were crazy or everyone heard hallucinations. No, Jaynes was far more nuanced. So let me explain it like I'm talking to you on a long night walk. You and I have something in our head right now. A narrator, an inner voice, a sense of I am me, the ability to reflect, to question, to doubt, to imagine future scenarios. Jaynes says, this wasn't always there. It developed recently, within the last 3,000 years, not 100,000 years ago, not in prehistoric caves, not with early tools. No, very late, almost yesterday in evolutionary time. The brain has two hemispheres. Today, they work together smoothly. But Jaynes believed ancient humans used them differently. The left hemisphere did the acting. Movement, speech, basic behavior. The right hemisphere generated a voice. Not imaginary, not symbolic, a literal auditory hallucination. This voice functioned like an internal ruler, a source of authority. And the crazy part? People thought it was a god, not themselves. That's the bicameral part. Bi means two. Chambers means mental rooms, two mental spaces, not integrated, not unified. Jaynes didn't say the voice was chaos. He said it was a problem-solving tool. When someone faced danger, confusion, or stress, the right hemisphere generated a guiding command. Go here. Fight. Stop. Pray. Bow. Climb. Run. Clear. Short. Authoritative. The left hemisphere obeyed. Sound familiar? It's what soldiers, trauma survivors, and athletes still experience today during extreme stress. This wasn't mental illness. This was the operating system of the ancient mind. Ancient temples weren't religious buildings. They were places where humans triggered the bicameral voice. Chants, prayers, drums, sacrifice, incense, statues, priest commands. All these things created predictable hallucinated guidance. Gods in Jaynes's theory weren't metaphors. They were mental hallucinations generated by the right hemisphere. And ancient people truly believed they were receiving instructions from divine beings. Not poetry, not stories, real voices. This is the boldest part. Jaynes argued that consciousness didn't slowly evolve, it emerged suddenly, because the bicameral system broke. Why? Because around 1200 BCE, civilizations collapsed, trade networks died, rituals failed, kings were murdered, famine spread, cities burned, gods stopped speaking. When the world became unpredictable, the voice system failed. Imagine depending on GPS your whole life, and one day it stops working. What do? You learn to navigate. That's what humans did. They developed self-reflection. They developed inner speech. They developed personal identity. They developed doubt. They developed thinking about thinking. Consciousness wasn't a gift. It was an emergency adaptation, a psychological survival response. A story we tell ourselves. This is the most beautiful part of Jaynes's theory. He says consciousness isn't your brain, your neurons, your thoughts, your memories, your emotions. Consciousness is the story you tell yourself about those things. It's a narrator, a storyteller, a commentator, a quiet voice that creates a sense of continuous me. Ancient humans didn't have that story. We do. And here's where it gets eerie. Jaynes believed the bicameral mind didn't vanish. It just became quiet. But under stress, or trauma, or meditation, or rituals, or grief, or psychedelics, or extreme focus, it comes back. Many people today hear guiding voices, feel unseen presences, sense commands, rely on intuition, hear inner protectors, feel spoken to in prayer, talk to their deceased loved ones. Jaynes says these are echoes of the ancient mind.
Let's travel back, far back, to a time when the world felt young, when writing was new, when cities were experiments, and when humans walked through life, not with a self, but with gods speaking inside their minds. Because if Jaynes was wrong, ancient texts should show self-awareness, personal reflection, moral struggle, inner debates. I thought, I decided, I questioned, but they don't, not at all. What we find instead is a world that behaves exactly like a bicameral mind. Let me show you. Around 2500 BCE, in Sumer and Akkad, people wrote about hearing voices constantly. Not metaphorical, not poetic, literal. They describe gods in the temple giving instructions, personal guardian deities speaking out loud, kings who obey commands from statues, priests who wait for the voice of the god. In the Code of Hammurabi, the king says, "The god Shamash spoke to me and gave me these laws." Not, "I thought of these laws." Not, "I planned this code." He heard it. That's pure bicameral behavior. The Egyptians believed every human had a ka, a spiritual double that guided your actions. But here's the part scholars stress. The ka spoke out loud. In tomb inscriptions, pharaohs write, "My ka commanded me." I heard the ka in my chamber. The ka directed my steps. This wasn't metaphor. The Egyptian mental world was full of voices, commands, divine instructions, and obedience to unseen agents. Sound familiar? It should. This is bicameral cognition in a highly structured society. Let's move to ancient Greece. Scholars have noticed something astonishing. Characters in the Iliad never think in first person. There is no "I wonder," "I reflect," "I question." Should I? Or shouldn't I? Not once. Instead, every major decision is caused by a god. Athena tells Achilles to stop. Apollo pushes Hector forward. Zeus sends Agamemnon a dream. Hera sparks anger. Ares triggers violence. The heroes don't decide. They're puppets of divine commands, which Jaynes says were the hallucinated voices of their own brains. The Iliad is essentially a documentary of bicameral behavior. Early biblical stories are filled with auditory commands, not inner wisdom, not metaphor, not symbolic messages, literal voices. And God said to Abraham, the Lord spoke to Moses, the Lord said to Samuel, a voice called to Elijah. These characters rarely think independently. They act on instructions. And in early Hebrew culture, visions and commands equal normal psychology. No introspection, no personal decision-making, No internal monologue. Just obedience. Jaynes would say, the right hemisphere spoke, the left hemisphere obeyed. Across cultures, ancient Persia, Vedic India, pre-Islamic Arabia, shamanic Siberia, early China, Mesoamerica, leaders, prophets, and ritualists all describe the same phenomenon, a voice giving orders. Shamans heard spirits. Oracle priests heard gods. Prophets heard divine beings. Kings heard voices of ancestors. It wasn't madness. It was their cognitive norm. And the consistency across continents suggests something deeper, a universal psychological structure that humans everywhere experienced. Why did ancient cultures chant for hours, beat drums, inhale smoke, fast, pray intensely, perform sacrifices, dance in circles, isolate in temples? You might think these practices were symbolic. Jaynes argued they were practical. Rituals created sensory overload, trance, stress elevation, dissociation, rhythmic entrainment, auditory hallucinations, all of which activate bicameral-style cognition. In other words, rituals weren't worship. They were mental technology, a way for humans to hear the voice clearly. It's all of them. Here's the eerie part. Every early civilization, every single one, shows the same psychological pattern. No introspection, no self-awareness, divine commands, externalized decision-making, hallucinated authority figures, obedience to inner voices, no internal monologue. This is not coincidence. This is a global cognitive structure, an ancient mental operating system. Exactly what Jaynes described. If the bicameral mind was a stable system, a working mental technology, then something dramatic must have happened to break it. Something big enough to silence the voices of the gods all around the ancient world. And that moment did happen. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, the greatest civilizational disaster in human history. Let me take you there. In just 50 years, nearly every major power in the known world collapsed. Egypt survived barely. Greece destroyed. Hittites gone. Mycenaeans gone. Ugarit burned overnight. Babylon fragmented. Trade routes gone. Writing systems lost. Population cut dramatically. Imagine the world economy collapsing today. All governments gone. All institutions destroyed. All leadership wiped out. That was 1200 BCE. Humanity didn't experience a disaster like this again until the fall of Rome over 1,000 years later. And during this collapse, my friend, the gods went silent. For the first time in thousands of years, people heard nothing inside their minds. No commanding voice, no divine instruction, no inner guide. Just silence. The bicameral mind thrived in stable, ritualistic societies. It needed predictable environments, repeated traditions, unquestioned hierarchy, familiar routines, temples, kings, rituals, structured obedience. But the collapse shattered everything. Cities burned, kings died, temples were destroyed, rituals stopped, famine spread, war became chaotic, people fled into forests and mountains. And when society fell apart, The mental system, built on structure and repetition, collapsed with it. Stress was no longer ritualistic. Danger was no longer predictable. Commands no longer matched reality. The brain's ancient voice generator couldn't adapt, so it failed. This moment, Jaynes argued, is when humanity faced something terrifying: free will, autonomy, choice, for the first time ever. Imagine your entire life you've always had a guiding voice that feels divine, and then suddenly, nothing. No answers, no direction, no authority, no clarity. Ancient writings suddenly become filled with grief, confusion, prayers, anxiety, longing for lost gods. In Egypt, inscriptions say, "The gods have turned away." In Israel, "The voice of the Lord no longer speaks." In Greece, "The gods are distant." This wasn't theology, it was psychology. Humans were experiencing the collapse of their internal guidance system, and they panicked. Before this, humans didn't feel guilt, inner conflict, self-blame, self-criticism, personal responsibility. Those emotions require introspection, which ancient humans didn't have. But after the collapse, we see for the first time in human history guilt in texts, moral questioning, regret, self-reflection, personal choice, internal struggle. These emotions appear suddenly in surviving writings because introspection was being born. The mind was reorganizing, creating new pathways, building a narrator, a meta-self, a reflective I. This was not evolution over thousands of years. This was a psychological emergency. Between 1200 BCE and 800 BCE, new types of literature appear: proverbs, hymns, reflective poetry, wisdom literature, personal prayer, moral introspection. Not gods commanding, but humans thinking. This is when we see the earliest Greek philosophers, the beginning of Hebrew prophets, the rise of rational writing, the creation of individual identity, the shift from myth to logic. In a few centuries, humanity transformed mentally. The bicameral world ended. Consciousness emerged, not as a gift from gods, but as a survival mechanism to replace the lost internal voice. Here's something wild. The Iliad, older, has no introspection. The Odyssey, newer, has a lot of introspection. Same culture, same people, but a different mental system. Jaynes believed the Odyssey was the first generation of conscious humans, people who had inner debate, questioned their actions, plotted strategically, reflected emotionally, lied intentionally, hid their thoughts. These are signs of consciousness. The transition was visible in real time. A new mental world rising from the ashes of a fallen one.
My friend, have you ever wondered what it feels like to wake up inside your own mind for the very first time? Not waking from sleep, but waking into self-awareness. That moment happened to humanity, not in the distant past of evolution, but surprisingly recently. Because after the collapse we explored in the last chapter, humans found themselves alone inside their minds, with no inner gods, no guiding voices, no automatic commands, just silence. And into that silence, something new began to form. A narrator. a self, a reflective I. The birth of consciousness. Let's explore how it happened. Imagine being an ancient person in 1100 BCE. You're used to hearing a voice telling you when to act, how to behave, where to move, who to trust, what to sacrifice, which ritual to follow. Your entire life runs on a psychological autopilot powered by divine commands. And suddenly, nothing. No instructions, no clarity, no sense of direction. It feels like being left in the dark after always walking with a torch. This void forced humans to develop a new skill: thinking for themselves. But thinking wasn't natural. It was uncomfortable, painful even. So how did we go from command to silence to introspection? Let's see. Without a God's voice, people began to rely on memory. Not memorizing facts, but recalling past commands, past rituals, past emotional patterns, past outcomes, past experiences. They built a mental model of what might be right to do. Memory became the first form of conscious strategy. Instead of, "the God says do this," it became, "last time something similar happened, maybe I should." This tiny shift was the embryo of consciousness. Something important happened next. Humans began using language inside their minds. Not spoken aloud, not commanded, internally. This was revolutionary. Jaynes believed consciousness is impossible without language, because language gives shape to thoughts like, "Why did this happen? What should I do? What do I want? How will this affect me? What if?" These are modern questions. Ancient humans didn't ask them. But once the voices vanished, they had to. And so language turned inward and became a narrator. The silent voice you hear in your head today was once the voice of a god. Now it's just you. Before consciousness, emotions were not feelings. They were external forces. Anger from Ares, love from Aphrodite, fear from a demon, inspiration from a muse, courage from a god, illness from a spirit. But after the collapse, humans began to realize emotions come from within. This realization created guilt, shame, regret, curiosity, self-blame, internal pride. These emotions require a self observing itself. Consciousness needs that observer. And this was the moment the observer evolved. Before consciousness, people didn't imagine the future. They obeyed commands in the present. But after the voices disappeared, humans had to predict, plan, and visualize different outcomes. This was the birth of imagination. Not storytelling imagination, strategic imagination. What if I go north instead? What if we plant earlier?
What if we build bigger walls? What if the enemy returns? These what-if structures are the foundation of consciousness. The mind became a simulation machine instead of a command receiver. This is the most beautiful part, my friend. Humans began to experience something we now take for granted. A sense of I. Not the body, not the mind, not the emotions, but a witness, a storyteller, a narrator, a center of identity. This I didn't exist in ancient bicameral humans. It formed slowly, through necessity. The moment humans started asking, why do I feel this way? What does this mean to me? Who am I in this story? The self was born. This is the beginning of autobiography, journaling, personal decision-making, and moral responsibility. The inner world opened its eyes for the first time. Something important emerged during this period. Personal writing. Letters, poems, reflections, stories, philosophy. Writing forced humans to look inward. Because when you write, you meet yourself. You see your fears, your motives, your memories, your values, your contradictions. Writing made the narrator stronger. It trained the inner voice. It reinforced the sense of identity. And that's how consciousness spread through entire civilizations. Before consciousness, people saw themselves as members of tribes, followers of gods, servants of kings, extensions of families. But with introspection came personal identity, personal purpose, personal responsibility, personal meaning, personal morality. Humans became individuals with internal lives. This was the true revolution. Not fire, not farming, not language, not tools. The invention of the self. When consciousness first awakened, humans didn't suddenly become wise, logical beings like the philosophers we admire today. No, it was messy, confusing, emotionally heavy. Imagine feeling inner conflict for the first time in human history. Imagine wrestling with decisions without a God's voice to tell you what to do. Imagine realizing, I am responsible for my choices now. This was revolutionary. It changed everything: religion, society, morality, relationships, even art and storytelling. Let's explore how civilization transformed when humans became aware of their own thoughts. Before consciousness, religion was simple. A God speaks, you obey. Rituals maintain order. But after the bicameral collapse, people no longer heard commanding voices. So religion changed. We begin to see sin, repentance, guilt, introspection, moral responsibility, personal virtue. These concepts did not exist before consciousness. They require inner observation, something only conscious beings can do. Think about the early Hebrew prophets. For the first time, the voice of God becomes moral guidance, not a literal command. God isn't shouting instructions anymore. Humans are reflecting on their own behavior. Religion becomes internal. This is the birth of conscience, ethics, personal accountability. The divine moves from temples into the human mind. This is where something breathtaking happens. Around 800 to 600 BCE, a wave of introspection spreads across the world. Greece, Thales, Heraclitus, Socrates. India, Upanishads, Buddha. China, Lao Tzu, Confucius. Scholars call this the axial age, the moment humans developed deep, structured consciousness. And notice the pattern. All these traditions focus on inner life. What is the self? How should we live? What is right and wrong? What is truth? What does it mean to be human? These questions were impossible for bicameral humans to even ask, because you need a narrator to wonder about the narrator. Consciousness made philosophy inevitable. Remember how the Iliad had no introspection? Now look at later Greek literature. Odysseus debates internally. Sophocles' characters wrestle morally. Euripides portrays emotional psychology. Herodotus writes personal reflections. Plato builds entire dialogues around inner reasoning. The shift is dramatic. Stories change from "the gods command us" to "we must choose wisely." This is the mark of consciousness taking center stage. Before consciousness, law was divine. Kings enforced the God's will. But after consciousness, humans create laws based on reason, fairness, ethics, consequences. The idea of intent appears. In bicameral times, intent didn't matter. You acted because a God commanded you. But now, did you mean to harm someone? What was your motive? What were you thinking? These are conscious concepts. Law becomes psychological. This is the moment, my friend, the moment the modern inner life begins. Humans start asking, what do I want? What should I become? What is my destiny? How do I find meaning? These questions did not exist in bicameral societies. Purpose was dictated. Identity was inherited. Life was automatic. But now, humans begin crafting their own stories. We see journals, personal letters, autobiographies, confessions, poetry, self-analysis. The self becomes a project, a story we shape, a journey we consciously walk. Ancient art was symbolic and ritualistic. After consciousness rises, art becomes emotional. We see realistic expressions, inner turmoil, moral struggle, spiritual longing, human vulnerability, individual perspective. Art is no longer about gods. It's about humans. Because humans finally have an inner world rich enough to express. The biggest transformation was this: the world stops revolving around gods and starts revolving around
human experience. This is the birth of democracy, philosophy, psychology, literature, moral systems, educational traditions, personal growth, self-reflection. The inner narrator reshaped the outer world. Consciousness wasn't just a mental shift, it launched the entire structure of modern civilization.
Let me tell you something surprising. We like to think of ourselves as fully conscious beings, rational, introspective, self-guided, masters of our decisions. But that's only half the story. Because beneath your conscious mind, beneath the narrator you hear every day, there is a much older system, a silent chamber, a leftover structure from a time when humans heard gods, followed commands, and lived without introspection. Jaynes believed, and modern psychology often agrees, that the bicameral mind still lives inside us in subtle, fascinating ways. Let's explore them. Have you ever felt a sudden, powerful sense of "don't trust that person"? Take this opportunity. Stop, something's wrong. Go for it. Leave now. You don't think these thoughts. They arrive, instantly, confidently, without explanation. That's not consciousness. That's a voice from a deeper system, an ancient decision engine. Not supernatural, not mystical, just older than your narrator. Jaynes would say, intuition is a gentle echo of the bicameral command voice. Think about anxiety, my friend. It's not a conscious fear. It's a physical alert, a push, a command without language. Ancient humans would have heard this as a literal voice. Danger, run, hide. But because consciousness replaced the voice, the command lost its clarity. Today it becomes restlessness, tension, panic, dread, tight chest, racing thoughts. The old system is still trying to warn you. It just doesn't speak the way it used to. As we discussed earlier, people under extreme stress often feel like there are parts inside them. A protector, a critic, a child, a survivor, a watcher, a commander. These parts can speak. They can instruct. They can override. Not metaphorically, literally. This is the bicameral mind re-emerging under pressure. A survival system older than consciousness. Across the world, people report hearing guidance during prayer, feeling spoken to during meditation, hearing a deceased loved one comforting them, receiving messages during grief, sensing divine instruction. This isn't madness. These are moments when consciousness quiets and the old bicameral pathway lights up again. Ancient humans lived in this state every day. We touch it only in rare moments. Writers say, the words came through me. I heard the character speak. The story wrote itself. Artists say, the painting told me what to do. Athletes say, in the zone, something else takes over. Musicians say, the melody arrived fully formed. This is not poetic exaggeration. This is the bicameral mind working silently behind the narrator, providing answers the conscious mind could never calculate. Children talk to imaginary friends as if they're real. They hear guidance in their minds as external voices. They interpret feelings as characters. This is the bicameral architecture in its developmental form. As the child grows, the conscious narrator strengthens and absorbs those voices. But for a short time, we all live in a world not unlike ancient humans. Think of moments when you hear, "You shouldn't do that. You know this is wrong. Apologize. Walk away." Where does that voice come from? It's not logic. It's not emotion. It feels like a separate presence inside you. Religious traditions call it conscience. Jaynes might call it the last civilized form of the bicameral command system, a voice we still respect even when we want to ignore it. Ever hear, "You're not good enough. You'll fail. Don't even try"? This voice is not conscious reasoning. It doesn't argue. It commands. It speaks in absolutes. It overrides logic. It acts like an external authority. This is an old mental structure misfiring in the modern world. A bicameral fragment still trying to protect you by controlling you.